Welcome to Reshaping the Future of Learning, the role of flexible policies and incentives reconsidered, given at the ICTOL conference in 2024. I've done a series of presentations that are connected to one another, and they form a three-part series. The first, in 2021, delivered at the ICTOL meeting, was about quality assurance in higher education and the role of instructional designers. I followed that up the next year at the ICTOL meeting, looking at the role of learning experience designers in the future of higher education. And then finally in 2023, and now again in 2024 with an updated version, I'm talking about flexible policies and incentives in educational technology and distance learning. In order to approach this topic, I took a look at leading reference works that are published in the field of educational technology and online learning. Because one would think that if policy matters, it would actually be discussed in these authoritative summaries of research that have been done and that feature the leading thoughts of various experts in this particular field of study. So if you look at the Springer Handbook of Open Distance and Digital Learning, published in 2023, it's 1,400 pages of potentially very useful information about open distance and digital learning. However, we have to note that only 45 pages, or about 3% of the total of this authoritative reference work, even mentions the word policy. In fact, when you look at it page by page across each of these 45 pages, you have about 15 pages or so substantively talking about policies as it relates to quality assurance. Most of the other mentions of policy are either in reference to a policy in a particular country at a particular point in time, or they simply mention the word policy just in passing in a single sentence and then move on to other matters. Not surprisingly, of course, the quality assurance chapter has far more information in it about policies, but even there, it is somewhat sketchy in terms of what it actually says about policies and about how learning designers could think about influencing those policies as you move towards the future. In a similar way, the AECT Handbook of Research in Educational Communications and Technology, which is now in its 5th edition, published in 2020, there is no entry in its extensive index mentioning policy at all. Policy making, policy makers, anything about regulations, etc. You don't see these kinds of things in the index. There's only a single chapter in the entire book that actually takes up directly issues related to policy, and that's an author who laments the fact that in the call for the 5th edition of the AECT Handbook, they did not get a single submission from anyone that actually took up the role of instructional design and technologies as it relates to broader purposes of education and learning, let alone talking specifically about policy. The author did go on to suggest that we need far better design cases in the field of educational communication and technology. We need to make much wider use of theory and theory building, and that there needs to be more formal testing of theories that are already promulgated within the AECT community. There's basically no discussion of the role that policy might also play in educational communications and technology in this very authoritative and widely recognized resource for learning experience designers. When we come to the Encyclopedia of Education and Instructional Technology, which appeared in 2020, the only policy mentioned in this entire volume is at the local level. And even then, the discussion focuses primarily on just talking about policy rather than delving into what the policies actually are, or how they were created, or how they could be shaped in the future. Similarly, when we look at the handbook for online learning contexts, digital, mobile, and open, and then lo and behold, after the semicolon, it says that this 2021 text looks at policy and practice, we get our hopes up and think, here at last is a reference work that really is going to take up policy in a very serious way. 23 chapters later, policy is only mentioned in one chapter title, and even in that, the article in question, it focuses on mobile devices and mobile learning in the country of Greece. But within this chapter, despite its title, there is still not much about policy making, policy makers, or the role that policy is playing in mobile devices or mobile learning, except to talk about some things about communication standards. The rest of this handbook, purporting to be about policy and practice, has a lot about practice, but very little direct materials, even mentioning policy, let alone discussing it in any length. So then we say, well, maybe it's in the peer-reviewed journal literature. It's not yet made its way into these authoritative kind of encyclopedias and handbooks. Well, if you look at the work of Ullman, Kimmon, Rosenberg, and Dash, who did a masterful summary of content that can be found in more than 2,500 articles in the 16 top journals in the field of educational technology that appeared between 2019 and 2022, there's no mention at all of policy in terms of one of the key topics that's discussed. I'm sure policy is mentioned in some of these 2,700 articles, but it doesn't rise to the level of discourse sufficient to make the list of their top topics that are talked about in these articles. There's a similar finding for their analyses of content on educational technology topics and tools that are found in Twitter for the entire year of 2022. So we have to conclude that even in peer-reviewed journals, there is little mention of policy and its critical role, and how learning experience designers can influence this policy, advocate for particular policies, seek to change certain policies, or seek to better integrate policies with one another. The 2023 ICTOL conference itself had as its theme, Shaping the Future of Learning, Key Technologies and Practices. When we look at the entire conference proceedings, and I focused only on the presentations that were delivered in English, out of the 119 English language presentations at the conference, only 3 focused on policy issues, and only one of those 3, which was my own presentation last year, focused explicitly on policy. Yet we clearly can understand that when we're talking about key practices in shaping the future of learning, that these kinds of technologies and the practices that accompany them are always situated in a much wider set of systems, which in turn are themselves heavily shaped and influenced by policies both inside and outside of education. That includes everything from funding mechanisms to standards to quality assurance to various kinds of decisions about particular technologies, this technology versus that technology, or their uses, appropriate uses, inappropriate uses, expectations, goals, etc. We have to ask ourselves, why is the situation like this? Why is there such a dearth of discussion about policy within the online learning community? One reason probably is because many people in this arena who are researchers are unfamiliar themselves with policy environments, and they don't have any real engagement or interactions on a substantial and ongoing way with policymakers, either at the local level or certainly at the national level. We might speculate as well that there's a lack of relevant skills on the part of researchers to influence policies and policy discussions. Researchers are trained to do research and to report those results out to wider publics. They are not really skilled at, nor are they trained in, how do you actually discuss policy in effective ways with policymakers? How do you take a research presentation and distill its key points and share them in an effective way with policymakers such that they really grasp the essence of what you're trying to communicate and they understand its possible implications for policies they might or might not be considering. A third mitigating factor is the fact that there are very long timelines associated with policy making. Many times, particularly large-scale kinds of changes in policy take place over a long period of consultation with various parties until finally the legislators then get around to actually crafting the language of the particular statutes or the particular kind of protocols or procedures that they're creating, or the funding streams that they're going to create in order to move particular policies forward in practice in a particular arena. This, of course, is a total disconnect with the review cycles of universities, where when they're trying to make decisions about faculty advancement and promotion, they want results that are concrete, that have been measured, and that have appeared within a given period of time so that they can have an impact on the decision that's made in regards to whether the person is promoted and or tenured at a particular faculty. These are the things that are most important and are most highly valued. The fact that you spent time engaging with policymakers many times in academic arenas is seen as a drag and a very bad influence on your progression as a researcher and as a well-known academic voice in a particular discipline or area. We might also speculate that the narrow trajectories of researchers themselves are driven these days by citation rankings and how many elite publications you can publish articles in. There's many counting systems that exist to take account of these kinds of things, and there are very stringent, in some cases, rules about how these things count or do not count. I can tell you almost overwhelmingly that if you look across tenure and promotion activities across the United States, you will see almost no attention to how public policy has actually been influenced by an academic who's being considered for some kind of promotion and tenure activity. The overwhelming volume of information in any given subfield also makes it very hard to add policy matters to the list of things you must read and keep up on. It's an entirely different body of literature than most academic research. It, of course, has researchers themselves who research on policy issues. So then you're talking about not only having to read the policies themselves, but also have to read research from other researchers who specialize in policy studies. This then runs smack into the stringent demands on researchers' time with teaching, administration, accountability, reporting issues inside your local university, as well as sometimes at a state level or at a broader level, provincial level, in regards to what your institution is or is not doing. And it also gets in the way of the necessary, expensive, complex, grant-seeking behaviors with which academics have to concern themselves if they're going to get funding for graduate students, for research assistants, to actually go out and produce research, or to find data, or to create data that can be subsequently analyzed and from which research insights can be gained. So we can begin to see that there are, in fact, many issues that impact why one might not see much attention to policies and incentives in this arena of online learning and educational technologies. If we think about what we might assess in terms of the needs, these are some basic questions we could ask. What kind of policies and incentives might be useful, cost-effective, and impactful? How can we know? How will we go about ascertaining this information? How can policy be influenced regarding standards or programs or financing, professional development, interoperability among systems? That's often a big problem in this space. And policy could be used to influence those things and to shape its future directions. How should learning experience designers themselves better leverage their own professional associations and research centers? Many professional associations in certain fields of research actually do engage very actively in policy arenas in order to influence future actions of policymakers. Other associations are less active in these arenas, and it requires specialized staff at the headquarters of the particular association who really have the skill set to go into policy arenas, make friends with various policymakers, make friends with the staffs of various policymakers, which sometimes is even more important than influencing or speaking directly to the policymaker themselves, and know how to communicate things effectively in an arena where you have very short time frames, very short attention spans, and you have to be able get to the detailed matters in a way that's approachable, understandable, concise, and effective. So there are also significant barriers to long-term policy formulation and evaluation, and we need to better understand these things, both ourselves as researchers and also when we're trying to work with people that are significant players in the policy arena and that influence in marked ways the ways in which policies and things are changed. So I hope this overview gives you some highlights and insights into what my article is discussing. I would greatly appreciate your input, any ideas you have as I take this article to its full conclusions and seek to publish it in the Journal of Online Education and Technology, the GTOL Journal. Thank you very much for your attention.